can't really get into that until we really unpack Jacques Lacan's symbolic order. He's a French psychoanalyst, and he has this idea of identity development and how identity is formed. So his theories are called the symbolic order, and there's three main realms. So we're going to start, and we're going to talk about the imaginary, which focuses on the pre-language infant and his or her relationship to the self, but not the self that you see in the mirror. The symbolic is the next realm, and that's trapped in the imprecise structure of language, and that's when the subject attempts to define the self in relation to external forces using language. And then the real functions in excess of language. So for Lacan, identity formation is in a constant struggle with the real. So firstly, the imaginary realm, just to get a little bit more about that, it's governed by the mirror stage. It's the moment when the infant starts to recognize itself as a subject existing in the world around it. So we have the mirror image the infant sees as stable and fixed. It's called the ideal I. So it's just, it's stability. There's just the infant forms its identity around this idealized self. But the image in the mirror is ultimately a falsehood because the infant itself exists in chaos. There is no fixed sense of identity for the infant. And this stage has to be gone through during infancy, because without going through and exiting the mirror stage, the infant cannot enter the symbolic and therefore can't become a self, because they can't start to define themselves through language. So two kind of important quotes from Lacan. The mirror stage concerns the infant in front of a mirror who overcomes, in a flutter of jubilant activity, the constraints of his prop in order to adopt a slightly leaning forward position and take in an instantaneous view of the image in order to fix it in his mind. And that's the idea that you see babies and they're like, yeah. And then at some point during the mirror stage, the specular I turns into the social I. This moment at which the mirror stage comes to an end inaugurates the dialectic that will henceforth link the I to socially elaborated situations. And that's when this infant kind of starts to realize that it's a self that exists in a world of not the self. So then, moving on to the symbolic is the subject's attempt to define itself through language. And the two key ideas from the symbolic are the other with a little o and the other with a big O. So the other with the little o is the recognition of the self and the forming identity, and that's all of the internal stuff. And then the other with a big O is the system of language and representation that exists outside the self. So it exists outside, but it's what the subject uses to define the self. Desire for the other is what shapes the self, but because language is so imprecise, you can't actually ever really get to a point where you're defining the self. It's complicated. So the subject uses speech to force the event into the word, or more precisely, into the ethos by which she relates in the present the origins of her person. And she does this in a language that allows her discourse to be understood by her contemporaries, and that also presupposes their present discourse. So that's the idea that you need to be able to use language to share yourself in order for people to understand the self that you've constructed. As language gains function, the less suited it is to speech, and when it becomes overly characteristic of one alone, it loses its function as language, for the function of language in speech is not to inform, but to evolve. And then, again, that's the idea that you need language in order to communicate with others, but if language becomes too precise and starts to only define one person, then you can't really, because if I'm just saying words that no one here has ever heard before, then you're not going to understand what I'm saying. So that language, imprecise, yeah. So the real is the most complex and complicated, but it's fundamental to existence. It's locked behind language. It's everything that can't be reached or described using language. It's easy to recognize, but it's impossible to define. So it's in moments of emotion and experience. It's all of the human experiences that you know when it's happening, but you can't really describe it. Lacan thought that a lot of surrealist painters got close to the idea of the real. And the real cannot be entered until death, which for Lacan is a triumph over the real, because when you die, you don't need language to define the self, so you have now transcended language, but you're dead, so that's not as helpful. And if you enter into the real before death, for Lacan, that's to enter into psychosis, and that's you wouldn't be able to define yourself because you're locked in your own head. It's fine. So reality and analytic experience often, in fact, remains veiled in negative forms, but it is not that difficult to situate. And that's the same idea that you can't really define reality in Lacanian terms, but it's there. Yeah. And then through brief moments of the senses and emotion, the subject can briefly gain access to the real, as the signifier, which has fallen silent in the subject, makes a glimmer of signification spring forth at the surface of the real, and then causes the real to become illuminated with a flash projected from below its underpinning of nothingness. And that's, again, the idea that in those brief moments of experience, you can actually get to the real without actually getting to the real. So for those of you who haven't read Harry Potter, just the main general basic idea, it focuses on this boy, Harry Potter, who enters into the magical world when he is 11 years old. When he was an infant, the Dark Lord Voldemort tried to kill his family and tried to kill him, and that curse ended up backfiring. So that curse is actually going to end up linking the two men in the future. When Harry first enters into the magical world, he kind of struggles to define himself. He's not really sure what his place should be, but as he progresses through school, he starts to take on the role of hero that's kind of already been assigned to him by the world, the wizarding world. And then, so going into Voldemort, Voldemort obviously is older than Harry. He existed before Harry. He also has a very similar backstory to Harry. He also was orphaned at birth, so he, like Harry, grew up in the Muggle world. So when he came to Hogwarts, he also had to kind of learn to define himself in this new magical context. And then, so Voldemort was always obsessed with power and control and those kinds of ideas. He never really had friends, he more had followers. And then he was also obsessed with immortality. And so that leads into this really tricky thing. They're called Horcruxes, which are containers that hold pieces of the soul. The way that they're created is you have to kill somebody, and then you perform this complex magic, and then a piece of your soul is in a physical object, and that will be, if you die, you won't actually exit the world because your soul will be contained in these physical objects. And that will be important later, which is why we went into so much detail. So another thing during this project, I came up with the idea of magical infancy, and that was how I used Lacan's theories of infant development for the 11-year-old Harry Potter and the 11-year-old Lord Voldemort, who was at that time called Tom Riddle. And it's the idea that because they've been removed from the magical world, they haven't defined themselves within the magical world, so then when they enter into the magical world again, they're going through that idea of the mirror stage all over again. Yeah. And it really only applies to Muggle-borns, or Muggles are the term for non-magic people, and it only applies to Muggle-borns or to children like Harry and Voldemort who were once part of the magical world and were then removed. It wouldn't apply to wizarding children because they would have grown up in that world. So, finally, into Harry Potter. So then, the primary idea was the Harry's mirror stage and his entrance into the symbolic, and that focuses around the Mirror of Erised, which is pretty fundamental to the first novel, and it's this magical mirror that if you look into it, you see everything that your heart desires. So that really, it's Lacan's mirror of identity formation. You look into the mirror, you see something that you want, it's something that's fixed, it's stable. Here we have Harry seeing his parents and his grandparents and his whole family. When he was growing up, that was really all he ever wanted, a family. So Harry stared hungrily back at them, his hands pressed flat against the glass, as though he was hoping to fall right through it and reach them. How long he stood there, he didn't know. And then this mirror also becomes crucial later on in the first novel. He is able to protect this magical object from Lord Voldemort by looking into the mirror, seeing himself receive it, and then he actually ends up receiving it in real life. And the reason he's able to do that is because he wanted this object, and he didn't want to use it, he just wanted to protect it. So that's why the mirror is kind of crucial to the first time that Harry really steps into the role of hero and starts to claim that idea. And then later in the series, he also takes on the symbolic label of the Chosen One. And so Harry has to fulfill the role that Voldemort created for him by trying to kill him. And there's this prophecy that says that the one to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born, yada yada. Neither can live while the other survives. So Voldemort's like, that's Harry, I'm gonna kill him. It's fine. So Lord Voldemort and his Horcruxes are ultra-physical manifestations of the symbolic. So I talked about the symbolic and how like the desire for these objects, for like the other forms the self. So Voldemort was so insecure in his personality and who he was that he actually physically created these objects that defined key aspects of his identity. So we have his diary that was like kind of his power and his dominance over Hogwarts. He was actually able to use that to attempt to kill students after he left the school. Next up was the ring that was from his magical grandfather. And so he always valued blood status, and even though he was a half-blood, he always valued purebloods over half-bloods. So that is, the ring represented that pureblood status that he's descended from. Next up is Helga Hufflepuff's cup. Helga Hufflepuff is one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts. So that was kind of his idea that he could dominate and control Hogwarts more than any other person could. The locket, it was Salazar Slytherin's locket, another of the 4 founders. He's actually descended from Salazar Slytherin, so it's kind of underlying that whole Slytherin connection. He's pointing out, like, I am part of Hogwarts history, I belong here. Yikes. So then next is Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, and that is, he actually managed to persuade one of the Hogwarts ghosts to tell him where the diadem was hidden, so that he thinks he's so clever and resourceful. Next up was Harry, and that he created Harry when he tried to kill Harry, so that was the Horcrux he didn't know about, and that was the Horcrux that he didn't mean to create. And then his final Horcrux was the snake. The symbol of Slytherin is the snake, so it's kind of continuing to underline that connection. And then there's also just the fear and power that comes with a giant snake coming at you. And then, so the real, Harry actually ends up entering into it in the last novel towards the end. And this happens when Voldemort tries to kill him. Voldemort actually only ends up killing the part of Voldemort's soul that was in Harry. So it's a place where thought and desire immediately resolve. Harry wished he were clothed, barely had the wish formed in his head and robes appeared. So it just like, desires are immediately granted. There's no pause between what you want and getting it. But Harry chooses to return to the structure of the symbolic in order to protect his friends. So he has this ability to exit the real without actually descending into psychosis. So then Harry's unstable position as chosen one, and this is kind of further deconstructing the symbolic. So we have this arbitrary prophecy that decides his fate. The prophecy actually could have applied to Neville. The 2 boys in infancy were super similar, but Voldemort decided that it was going to apply to Harry. So he's the one who chose Harry, and that's why Harry's the chosen one. Harry's life experiences make him into who he is, and that includes the prophecy. So the prophecy that's kind of been overshadowing who he is since birth, he eventually becomes part of that prophecy. So he also eventually ends up choosing to accept that the prophecy is true, and the role of chosen one was created by the prophecy. And the reason that I'm highlighting neither can live while the other survives is that neither Harry nor Voldemort's lives can truly begin until the prophecy is fulfilled, because while the prophecy hangs over them, they have to exist in relation to each other. So both Harry Potter and Lacanian theory enhance the other, and they also kind of push back against each other. So we already talked about how I applied the mirror stage to adolescents, not actual infants. Voldemort needs the symbolic so badly that he physically manifests his others into objects, and Harry, instead of descending into psychosis, finds clarity within the real and is able to return from it. Lacanian theory provides a richer, more theoretical reading of Harry Potter, and we talked about how I deconstructed the ideas of hero and chosen one. And then kind of the whole point of all of this is these symbolic labels can influence people, and even though it might not be the way someone sees themselves, if you keep getting called the same name, you might eventually take on that identity for yourself. So even though those ideas are arbitrary, the labels can affect who a person is and how they see themselves. So these societal labels can lead people people to seeing only that. And so it's kind of important to recognize what ideas might have shaped who a person is and kind of be more open to accepting the different things about them. Yeah.